Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming to listen. I think before I dive into how we can apply visual design principles to API design, I just kind of wanted to share sort of why APIs to me matter. So I'm the technical co-founder of a business called Ably. We provide real-time APIs for developers. So in essence, our product is just an API. That's the only thing we provide. And the way our customers judge us is on the quality and how their experience of that API. I've recently joined the Open API Initiative, the board of the API Initiative, and also the Async API spec. Both of these are specs that are trying to define how people consume APIs and how we describe APIs. And interestingly, I heard earlier that the Open Source Initiative, it was their birthday, but it's also actually the Open API Initiative. It's their third birthday, so which is great. And the third thing is we're at Ably, we're hatching up a plan to launch something this month, which is around encouraging developers to share data. And what we mean by that is share real-time data. And that's delivered through a program that we're sponsoring, which is the Open Data Streaming Protocol program. And that's delivered using real-time APIs. Obviously, I care about the APIs that people use and open standards. So, given the context of this talk, I think it's quite easy to fall into this trap of thinking that visual design principles only apply to visual interfaces. So, if you ask a typical developer, the people we're talking to, you could very quickly think that actually the thing that I suppose the visual aspects of what they think about are, the marketing collateral, the website, potentially even the documentation. And I think that's partly true. I think, what we're actually dealing with is developers, right? And they spend most of their time when they interact with us and our APIs, they're spending most of their time in code, right? And those are the APIs that they expose to, and that's the experience they have. So, the same sort of design principles that we apply generally to visual design, to things like documentation, which I'm sure we would all had experience sort of thinking about how we make that aesthetically better and how we lay that content out. I think you have to go through those same ideas when you're designing APIs. And this is what this talks about. So I don't think anyone's going to disagree that design is important, but I wanted to kind of summarize why I think design matters, and I've kind of distilled this down into three things. And even as a developer, I mean, I'm probably happier sitting writing code, but I sincerely appreciate the value of design and the impact it has and how it changes your perception of the thing that you're interacting with. And so I think the first thing is really when you think about design. Design is function, right? Design is not just design in isolation. And Steve Jobs kind of coined this pretty well, which is, design is not what it looks like and feels like. Design is how it works. And, I think if you embody that sort of thinking, that the two fit together, right? Like good design and bad function, or great function but terrible design, will still result in a pretty bad experience. So, I think the important thing to remember is that those two things together is what delivers a good design experience, and the whole idea of the design process is about also reviewing the function. And I don't know how many of you were around sort of 15, 20 years ago when doing sort of e-commerce integrations and things like that, but I saw that WorldPay are sponsoring things. So but interestingly, 15 years ago, they were the leader, right? That was the interface we had to work with, and to be honest, the developer experience wasn't great, but then no one's developer's experience was great. They were probably the best of the lot, and what that did is Stripe came along, and I think what Stripe demonstrated is that they understood that design and function together is effective, right? So it looked good from a sort of visual interface for what they were delivering, but if you look at what actually is really incredible there is they've distilled from 15 fields that needed to be filled in down to what visually is presented as one, which clearly isn't. But that was powerful, and that really made a big difference when they came around, that people, developers were kind of proud to integrate Stripe because it was kind of embedded, it was beautiful, and it was very functional. And, but I think what Stripe did, which was really interesting, is that that sort of design and function, I suppose, approach to everything permeated through everything they did, right? It permeated through how they interacted with developers. And so their APIs were intuitive, the APIs were simple, their documentation was fantastic, they're great examples. And I think a lot of what we're doing now is everyone has played catch up and everyone is equally delivering great experiences. But they really were pioneers at the time. And I do believe a lot of their success can be attributed to their firm belief in design and function coupled together. I think the next thing with design that we need to think about is that design has an amazing ability to kind of create a first impression, and everyone makes snap judgments. That's just the way we work, and it's very hard to change those perceptions once they've been made. So, applying design principles to create the best possible experience for developers at the outset, from the first time they interact with the API, is important, and not fundamentally having a bad perception of your product that you then have to fix later on. So, I'm not saying let's not fail. I'm not saying let's wait and get it perfect. That's not at all. It's just, let's at least apply the best knowledge we can when we're designing APIs and get it as good as possible. So, I think, the thing that I find really interesting is the automotive industry, when it comes to design, really embodies the power of design. I mean, if you look at this is a Yugo from 1985, which was produced in the old Yugoslavia, you can kind of, just looking at that, it tells you a lot about the car, right? And, you can see that it's clearly meant to be cost-effective, functional, and it's not a performance beast, right? And the Ferrari on the right kind of says that, right? And the only thing we have to measure that is the design. And so I think it's really important that we think about what perception are we creating. It doesn't have to be the Ferrari, but it could be, I want to be, creating a perception of robustness. I want to create a perception of easy to use. But you have your first chance. When the first time a developer interacts with your APIs, that is the lasting impression you're going to leave with them, and it's very hard to change that. And then the third thing I think with design that I think is really important is about the fact that design allows you to amplify your message. The process of one of the things that you'll often hear designers say is it's about taking complexity and distilling it down to simplicity. It's easy to do things that are complex or present complex ideas. It's very hard to present complex ideas in a very simple way. And the sort of design process encourages you to think about that. So, I think the problem as a developer is that you always have someone who says, I need this new feature, I need this new method, I need this extra argument, I need some more attributes on the thing that I'm providing. And that's a trap, because every time you add, you're actually reducing from everything else, right? So if I have 3 design principles here, and if I was on number 773, it would be pretty meaningless, right? So, every time you add, you're actually subtracting from everything else. So I think it's quite important to think about the fact that design allows you to communicate a message, but you can only communicate so much. So, this really leads on to the sort of point of my talk, is that API design is a new discipline. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. API has been around for a very, very long time. But I think it's only really in the last 5 years or so that we've seen huge successful businesses that a lot of what you can attribute to their success is by having amazing APIs, having good developer relations, having a good developer experience. They value developers. And I get quite involved in the sales process as well as sort of techie stuff, and I can tell you that in the sales process, the interesting thing is a CTO will buy the product, but a developer has a veto, right? If a developer says, this API is just horrible, I hate the experience, there's a better product I can use, they can kind of veto a product. So the developers may not be the ones who are choosing the products necessarily, but they certainly have a veto, and they have a lot of buying power. And I think if we think of API design, it's a new discipline because of that. We haven't been sharing information about how to build APIs. And obviously, earlier with the open source initiative, they were saying that DevRel has been around a long time, really, within the open source community, which is great. But how to build great APIs and how to build those developer relations programs, it's a new discipline. So I think when you're in uncharted territories, it makes sense to look at other industries and see where they have learned, what lessons they've learned. So I think visual design, graphic design has been around as a discipline for probably about 100 years. And as a result, they've kind of distilled down to a core set of principles that designers will go and learn as part of their discipline. And I think we can pull on some of those, because what design is about, it's about communicating a message, right? It's about creating a good experience. It's about creating perception of what your product represents. and it's around distilling that down. So I've kind of pulled out what I think are probably the 8 most common design principles, and there's obviously a lot more than this, but you can see that these are the 8 design principles that if you have to try and distill down, that's probably the key ones. I think in the context of API design, it would be a bit of a stretch to say that color was something we could apply, and I would say alignment is also probably not really applicable. And then when I sort of looked at that again, I thought that individually, a lot of these concepts in the context of API design really can be grouped together. And I'd like to just sort of put the caveat here that this talk is really around applying this thinking to APIs, as in SDK APIs, programming APIs, as opposed to REST APIs or documentation. But of course, this sort of thinking, this design thinking, as we've seen with Stripe, it's a way of thinking that can apply to anything. But for the purpose of this talk, I've focused on code. So before I sort of jump into a bit of code examples, do you mind if I just ask hands up of who here is a developer and who's here familiar with code? OK, well, good. I'll dive into code then. So, OK, so the first principle is hierarchy and proximity. The idea being that, obviously hierarchy allows us to group things together, if you think of a sort of discovery of a developer, I always like to think of, I like to sort of think through the API as someone using it with an IDE, right, with autocomplete. So you would type an object, and you would go dot, and it would present the things that are available. And that's the hierarchy, right? So you'll then have something else, dot something else. And the grouping really is a concept that in design terms would be keeping similar things together because it makes sense. But I think hierarchy and proximity in API design are roughly the same thing. So if we take this example here, you can see that a typical SDK, and sadly often generated by sort of code generators, would generate a pretty flat structure. And that's fine, except in terms of cognitive load, there's quite a lot to digest there, right? And kind of going back to the thing of the idea of messaging, what key messages are you describing? You're not really describing anything. You're just describing a bunch of methods that people can call. And so if you took that same code, this is all pseudocode and a pseudo Ably-like client library, but that's not what it is. And so the idea is if you take the things that relate to connection and you bundle those together under the connection object, then you'd have client.connection and client.channels, right? So now you only have 2 things at the root level. So we've created hierarchy, and we've grouped things together by bundling those methods within that object. And there's a couple of tricks. I mean, from a code perspective, you can use things like overloading. Instead of having publish, publish batch, publish encrypted, if your language permits, then use overloaded methods. And that allows you to kind of keep conceptually the idea together whilst offering deeper functionality behind that. And if you look at this is kind of going back to this, one of the first things I said important about design. This simplifies how people consume APIs. You've got to assume, I think, that not all developers are going to be reading documentation. I tend not to read documentation. Some people go straight to documentation. We find a lot of our developers go straight to tutorials. Developers approach problems in different ways, and you have to kind of cater to all of those. And this is really about the kinds of developers who will discover it via the API itself or the source code. The next concept, design principles that I grouped together are contrast and balance. Once again, contrast doesn't exist in code. And balance is really around, generally in a design, visual design, it's about how you distribute your elements, either symmetrically or asymmetrically on the page, depending on what kind of effect you're trying to create. But I think it does apply to code, because I think, with contrast and balance, I think it kind of goes back to the whole thing of cognitive load, right? The more we put into it, the less contrast each thing has, right? So the less we have, the less we can show people at the time they're discovering an API. Effectively, what we're doing is creating contrast. We're creating something that stands out and something that doesn't stand out. So we take an API again that, looking at, that would be a pretty normal API. I have a publish method and a publish batch. And in there, what you see is, I suppose it's all, again, hypothetical, but probably what happened is that method started off just taking publish data, right? Because someone just wanted to publish some data. And then a feature was developed, and they said, oh, we wanted to add push notifications, because push notifications were the feature we wanted to add, so you added another argument. And then someone said, well, I needed some metadata, so you added extras. And you can see what's happening is that that method is just constantly getting the contrast, as in the thing that's standing out there. There is nothing standing out. The only thing we can rely on at best is the alphabetical ordering of things. And that's bad, right? So I think the thing that you can do with this is try and think about, don't let the minority affect the majority of use cases. So the 80-20 rule, but probably to the extreme. I would say it's the 95-5 rule. 95% of people need to probably just need to use the publish method. And so provide the publish method, provide a way to dive in and see more detail by accessing things like a message object with all the hidden features beneath there. I've been told I'm running out of time, so I'll speed up. Repetition and space. The idea is that repetition allows, so if a developer is reading your API, once they've understood a concept somewhere, they can understand the same concept in another object. So, and again, kind of with the cognitive load, you've got an on-connection method, connected method. Maybe later you need an on-disconnected. And these states will grow, right? And that dilutes the API because you're creating more surface area over that API. So, you could do things like don't have different methods, even though they're conceptually slightly different things. You can say, have an event method, which is on, and they have one method, which is on event, and that's it. And it applies to both. So through the repetition of the same method names, you can kind of reinforce concepts. So quick design checklist. I think the things that I would advise you do when you're designing APIs is live in the developer API mindset. Think about how they're going to discover your API. And it may not be through documentation. It may be through your actual API. Use the 3 design principles I've mentioned. There's a common concept of make your design invisible. If you can see the elements, if you can see things sticking out, then that means your design is not invisible. Good design means you can't see it. The 80-20 rule I just talked about earlier, don't let a few use cases permeate the entire API and create more surface area. Finally, a quick plug. We are sponsoring an open data stream program. The idea is that we want to encourage developers to share data, real-time data specifically. You can think of it a bit like a GitHub for data streams. So we've got a lot of data sources already in there, open data sets like flight information and weather and transport. And the reason I'm plugging it here is that you all have DevRel programs, and you probably have APIs. And if you have data that is open data and you want to publish it through our platform for free and make it available to developers for free, we are sponsoring, a bit like GitHub does for open source code. We're trying to do the same thing for open data. And that's me. Thanks a lot. If you follow me on Twitter, I will post up the slides afterwards. Great. Thank you very much.